What's more important, words or grammar? That's what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm talking about it because your vocabulary, your passive vocabulary in particular, is kind of a measurement of how good you are or potentially can be in the language. And everything I do in terms of my input-based learning is oriented towards increasing my vocabulary. But of course, when we go to speaking, we want to speak as accurately as possible. We want our grammar to be as good as possible. So how do we improve our grammar? So I remember when I was teaching English as part of my activities at Link, and I would give the learner a report where I categorized the mistakes that the learner made. And I realized very quickly that the major problem people had wasn't so much specific aspects of the grammar, it was their use of words. They used words together that didn't really belong together or weren't natural in how the learner used those words. And that was a bigger problem for most people than tenses or prepositions or the use of the article and other sort of fine points of English grammar. And then I thought, there are certain things in languages that I speak well, say French, which I think I speak quite well, that I regularly have trouble with. For example, I caught myself the other day saying, de mon avis, in my opinion, which is wrong. It's à mon avis. And I've been saying that for a long, long time. And gradually, by focusing in on it, I think I've caught that to where I can start automatically saying à mon avis. And I also thought of when I was learning Chinese, in particular Mandarin Chinese, my emphasis, and with Japanese, was on basically trying to understand the patterns of the language rather than focusing in on specific grammar rules. So with a little more research, apparently languages are divided in terms of how sort of grammar intense they are. So a language like Chinese has few inflections, few changes to the words, and the prepositions do a lot of the heavy lifting, and the forms of words don't change. Then you have, English, which used to have a lot of inflections, which has fewer inflections now. Very few things change. And we rely more on sort of the idiomatic use of the language. Therefore, people sometimes refer to chunking or phrasal verbs, or all these different collocations. In other words, ways of describing how there are certain natural collections of words that are used by the native speaker and which the learner has trouble mastering. Now, if we go to Japanese, I also focused more on patterns rather than grammar explanations because it's also, while it's an agglutinative language, so things are added to the ends of words to imply the function or to determine the function of that word, in a sentence. But there again, it's more a matter of patterns, learning patterns, rather than having to ace specific endings, verb endings, noun endings, adjective endings, as is the case with verbs in the Slavic languages, or in particular the Romance languages, or for German and for Slavic languages, the case endings for adjectives, pronouns, nouns, things of that nature. There, it's much more finicky. So to some extent, those languages are considered more grammar heavy. So if we look at the types of mistakes that we can make in a language, I mentioned the à mon avis, which is correct, as opposed to de mon avis. That's kind of like a chunk. That's a phrase. That's an isolated phrase which I can focus in on and try to improve on. But if I look at, say, French, the ER verbs, the IR verbs, and so rather than the explanations, I think because there are clear patterns there, the verb conjugations are easier because the pattern repeats. With gender, there are, in some languages, like in Spanish, Portuguese, most Romance languages, there are some patterns there that can be explicitly pointed out to us, or that we will naturally start to integrate into our, use of the language. Where there are patterns, it's easier to become better at those things. And so in gender, for example, in Spanish is more obvious than in French, so it's more difficult in French than it is in Spanish. But then if we get to case endings in, say, the Slavic languages, where we're dealing, each of these endings incorporates issues of gender and the function of the word, which in, say, English might have been provided by a preposition. So all of those things are incorporated in the case ending of verbs and pronouns and nouns. So it becomes more difficult. The pattern is less clear. And then we add to that the sort of confusing explanations where certain prepositions take certain cases, and other prepositions take different cases, or certain verbs take the genitive, certain verbs take the accusative, and it's not obvious why that is. Or in the case of Slavic languages, where, the animative, like if it's a person or an animal, it's one form. If it's a impersonal, thing, then it's another form. And there's all kinds of explanations like that, which make it even more difficult to learn to use these endings correctly. And of course, the big problem with getting the grammar right is not when you're reading something. We can normally figure it out because there's a lot of redundancy. So you might get it wrong, but typically when you're listening and reading, you're getting the sense, the gist of what's there. When you go to speak, of course, you have to now automatically produce the correct form, whether it be a correct gender, or in the case of, we have articles in English, they don't have them in Slavic languages. So it's difficult automatically to produce the correct form of some of these things, where the pattern is more difficult for the brain to develop a sense of, to recognize. So it is possible to, I noticed when I was learning Russian, for example, I would focus in on the instrumental case. For whatever reason, I found that easier. I noticed it better, and I started to be able to produce it better. It seemed to roll off my tongue better when I was trying to, with some degree of automaticity, output the language. And obviously, à mon avis is something now, even though I probably made that mistake for many years, it's enough of an individual case that I can focus in on it. But how many of these things can we focus in on to that same degree? Not many. So we're still dependent on hoping to develop some sense of the language, some automatic ability to output the language correctly. And we know that with the child begins speaking incorrectly. The mother or parent may correct the child, but that has very little impact on the child, who continues making the same mistake until through enough input, the child starts to correct naturally, auto-correct him or herself. The adult can do the same thing, but the adult already, the language, the form of the language can have started to solidify, and so that the adult has a whole, sense of the language, and it's more difficult then to make corrections. And we've seen that in people, immigrants who are, or non-native speakers who are quite fluent in the language, and will continue to make the same mistakes, often reflecting the pattern in their native language. And even though the child will usually autocorrect, the adult will often not, even if mistakes are pointed out. And I've had this experience again teaching at Link. You correct the person and they just continue making the same mistake over and over again. So it's very difficult ultimately. And there is research which shows that self-correction, like if you notice something, and I've spoken before about the need to notice what's happening in the language, you have to want to notice. And so if I notice when I hear à mon avis, I notice it, okay, I can gradually start using that correctly. If I notice a case ending in a Slavic language, I don't know that noticing translates into using it correctly, but it's part of the process. And I think we just have to continue trying to notice things that we want to improve at. And to that extent, reading a table or reading a grammar explanation can help us notice things. But here again, grammar books are written by people who know the language. So I have a grammar book on English. It's full of extremely complicated explanations, which are kind of meaningless to me in a way, except that I know what they're talking about. So to that extent, it becomes meaningful. But if I don't have that degree of familiarity with the language, the grammar explanation itself is, to me, a lot of confusion. You first have to almost know the language before these explanations can help. And at that point, they may help you to notice certain things that slowly you might be able to produce more correctly than you have in the past. So where do I end up in all of this? I think we have to be realistic. I think we have to focus, as I've said before, on acquiring as many words as we can, getting used to how these words are used with other words, allowing the brain to get used to these patterns, and accept the fact that there will be ongoing inaccuracies that we can gradually improve on. Those that are more generalized and where there are no obvious patterns like gender, it's very difficult. And maybe we have to be realistic and just accept the fact that our number one goal should be to increase our vocabulary, therefore our ability to understand the language, our ability to communicate, our ability to read, to understand, and then slowly, where possible, where we identify problems, go in there and gradually, with some effort, become better at automatically producing the language correctly. So I hope that helps. Bye for now.